Hi, my name is Simone Savannah. I am going to talk a little bit about my own collections, my poetry, and how my research and writing sort of influences my teaching and really what I want students to get out of the classroom, or how I want them to sort of find pleasure in the classroom. My poetry collections, like Kansas and uses of my body, grew out of my critical interest in oppositional poetics, expressed in the work produced by women and women writers of color throughout the 20th and 21st century. I find in their fiction, poems, essays, songs, films, and plays explorations and examinations of women's complex subjectivities, as well as strategies of resistance against the oppression they experience in their specific political and social lives. Their opposition resists power and domination and seeks to remove the distance between writing and experience. I read women's oppositional writing as a literature shaped by demands for social transformation, a process that critically engages words and consciousness. These writers invent as well as work within and against various literary traditions and various social movements, feminist movements, Black arts, Black power, and Black Lives Matter to provide insight into women's complex subjectivities. They construct and maintain literary spaces through which women writers and women can gain visibility as well as personal and political autonomy. I examine my own writing, my poetry in particular, in oppositional terms. Like Kansas began as a scattered number of notes, and that's my chapbook. It began as a scattered number of notes and personal stories about sex and sexuality, and about my living in Kansas, attending a predominantly white institution as a Black woman. I noticed common themes of race, gender, and sexuality connecting them. The poems mostly focus on the body and consider the historical perception of Black womanhood and the Black female body. I began discussing that history in connection with my current living, particularly the racial and sexual microaggressions that I confronted in my daily life. I found myself merging and juxtaposing details of my personal life with those of other Black women's lives, including my mother's. I intended to compose an oppositional narrative that explored the complexities of Black womanhood and resistance, locating my confrontations with the issues of race, sex, and class within the collective. In my book, Uses of My Body, discussions, anger, the erotic, and the personal converge with my readings of Black feminist literature and scholarship. My goal is to establish an oppositional poetics that is deliberate in its quest for survival and autonomy, and in its examination of racial and sexual politics. My confessional poems and performances, my poetry performances, assist me in articulating theories and concerns in Black feminist literature as they relate to my experiences of erasure, sexual and racial violence, and of pleasure and healing. My title borrows from Audre Lorde's essays, Uses of the Erotic and Uses of Anger. So I'm going to really just work with uses of the erotic here, so that we might think a little bit more about taking back that sort of pleasure or redefining pleasure, especially when it comes to writing and being in the classroom. And uses of the erotic, Lorde distinguishes the erotic from the pornographic. Patriarchy and the male gaze have vilified and devalued the erotic by limiting the exercise of the erotic as a service women provide to men. Women, she argues, have been taught only by the suppression of the erotic within our lives and consciousness can women truly be strong. Misnamed by men and used against women, the erotic has been equated with the pornographic, which Lorde argues is an opposite and direct denial of women's power to make their lives possible and less difficult or absent of oppression. She writes that empowered women are dangerous, so we are taught to separate the erotic demand from the most vital area of our lives other than sex. Lorde is speaking of the erotic as a life source of women, the creative energy that empowers women, the knowledge and use of it to reclaim language, history, and our personal lives, to nurture the emotional, the spiritual, and the political, and to work against facets of oppression. As in my poetry, I aim to facilitate erotically satisfying experiences in creative writing classrooms. My goal is to help students reclaim pleasure, excuse me, or the erotic through text and activities. Some of the prompts that I provide for students ask them to examine erotic moments in text by women writers and to write poems that reflect their own idea of an erotically satisfying experience. For instance, I ask students to examine women's poetry, specifically confessional and personal poems by women poets, to discuss how the poet's exploration of the personal is an erotic act toward freeing oneself from the confines of patriarchy or often damaging political and personal histories. Some of the 20th century texts include Sylvia Plath's Elegy, Daddy, and Adrienne Rich's Diving into the Wreck. We also read and examine personal and confessional poems by contemporary Black women poets, including Robin Cost Lewis and Morgan Parker, who complicate the personal poem. They speak of gender and class, as well as race. Representing concerns of Black feminism, they view the erotic as a journey towards selfhood in which Black women must consider the ways in which a racist, sexist history has affected their personal lives and choices regarding their bodies and their writing, excuse me. We also consider poems by Black women performance poets who encode race and gender in the oral poems. We think about how their poems should be read and heard as assertions of African American women about their difficult lives and the ways they have reclaimed themselves from racist, sexist perceptions of womanhood. And of course, what women should be writing. The creative writing classroom, located in this patriarchal world, these departments, can be an oppressive place where pleasure is absent or unheard of. And my goal in providing these erotic texts is for students to realize and redefine their own pleasure. So creating that sort of opposition in the classroom as much as we are reading those oppositional texts. I hope that through their examinations and contact with these poems, that it goes beyond relating to a text via memory or just consuming text as it relates to their personal lives. I want the contacts to empower them or to help them think about how they might work toward autonomy in their own lives and writing, or how they might use specific devices, so including orality and movement when it comes to spoken word poetry or when it comes to simply reciting poems aloud. To use those devices to write personal pieces that communicate or embody pleasure as Black women, as women of color. And really my hope is to create an erotic environment for students where they write toward resistance and survival, toward autonomy and freedom. Thank you.